Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cybersecurity and ISO 27001, Implementing a Secure Information Security Management System. My name is Karen Rawson. I'm the Vice President of the DESARA Group, and I'm joined by Bob Bretal, one of our lead consultants, and Stephen Weekly, who's the Global Process Owner for ICT certification at the certification body SAI Global. Let me tell you a little bit about the DESARA Group, and then Stephen will tell you about SAI Global. The DESARA Group is a consulting company that helps companies get to the point where they're ready for certification. We also do internal audits on your way to certification or even afterwards, because that's sometimes a competence that is hard to build up inside a company. And we can do supplier audits, or when things go wrong, we can go in and do investigations. And finally, if you're just getting started and you just need somebody to go in and say, where do we stand now before we start implementing, we can do those kinds of gap assessments, whether it's for getting started or going through a merger acquisition or so forth. And now Stephen Weekly will tell you a little bit about SAI Global.
Okay, for those of you who haven't heard of SAI Global, it's a company that originated in Australia probably about 15, 16 years ago. But in recent times, we've moved our headquarters to Boston now. Our role in life, I guess, is multiple. Assurance is what we're talking about now, which is providing certification against various management standards. We also have a very large risk and compliance group who are developing and marketing integrated risk management solutions. So the software that you can use to implement your risk management and compliance solutions. And we're also very actively involved in standards and being able to provide those in numerous ways. There's a lot more that we do. If you're curious, I would go and have a look at our website at saiglobal.com.
And as you can tell by the accent, I'll bet, Stephen is from down under. He's calling in from the evening over in Perth, Australia. But they do serve clients globally and have quite a presence in the United States. The agenda for our presentation today is that we're going to talk a little bit up front about why companies get involved in information security and how they approach it. But the meat of the webinar is their highlighted ISO 27001 overview. We want to go through what is required, the body of the standard, as well as something special in ISO 27001 that, if you're familiar with ISO 9001, doesn't have anything like it. That's Annex A, the ways that you protect your information and all the rules behind what are the things that you can do, that you need to do to make sure your information assets are safe. We'll also talk about, if you're just getting started with 27001, how your company would go through implementation. And I'll talk about those things, and then Stephen will take it over and talk about what you do with a certification body to actually achieve certification. And we'll end with you with a chance to ask some questions and talk about how to get started and what next steps you need to take. When you received confirmation for this webinar, you were given a link to a workbook. If you didn't download it yet, you should see on the control panel for GoToWebinar, that little box that popped up when you logged in, that there would be handouts there that you can download, or go back to the confirmation email. You can download it, and it may help you take notes and keep track of what are some of the important points in this webinar. Have something to take away to share with your colleagues. Now, you're in the right place in this webinar. If you're senior management, this is not just an IT webinar. You see, the senior managers need to understand what's out there that may need to be done in terms of current models and trends that are coming up in information security management for what your customers may be looking for. And if you're senior management, your job is to avoid risks and take advantage of opportunities. So you need to know what's going on in the standard, just as IT leadership needs to, where of course they've already taken many, many steps on the IT side to protect the risks to information, but they recognize that if the full organization is engaged at all levels, you'll get much more robust information security. Now, the technical staff is certainly working towards what they've been told to do to keep information secure, but there may be additional steps, will probably be additional steps that technical staff needs to take. And this webinar will allow you to see the big picture of what the organization may be trying to do. Quality professionals are in the right place because you've already worked on developing a management system, and you'll see in a few minutes that there are a lot of elements of ISO 27001 that mirror what you already know about quality management systems, and you can help get your company up to speed on ISO 27001. Salespeople are sometimes the ones that actually bring the need for ISO 27001 into the organization because they'll see it in a contract, or customers will ask, what would it take for you to get to this level? And hey, you can just fill out one check mark, or you can fill out this 48-page survey about your information security profile, and salespeople would really like to understand what it means to have that certification. When you think about why is information security important to an organization, and what does security actually mean, one of the first things we often think of is we don't want our secret information to get into the hands of the wrong people. We don't want our competitors to know our business plans. We don't want our customers to know maybe some of the wrinkles under the hood, or the stuff that maybe doesn't work quite right, or the things that we're planning for the future so they won't buy just yet. Confidentiality of our information is very important. But information security isn't just about confidentiality. It's about the integrity of our data. How would you like it if you went into work on a data set thinking that you were making some business decisions and the data was corrupt? Or you were only working with a part of a set of the data when you thought you had the whole thing and you make a wrong decision. So the integrity of the data, or the fact that it's all there and it's not, nothing has gotten stored in the wrong place, for example, electronically, is important to you. And then when we think of the confidentiality and integrity of information, we're kind of making the underlying assumption that I think we all operate on, just like we expect we can always turn on a TV and there'll always be something on it. We expect to always turn on our computers or always have access to our files and so forth. What if there's a physical disaster and you can't get to those, or the servers have been knocked out in some way, or the network won't function? So information security is about making sure that data and information are available all the times you may need them, according to whatever your business plans are for how much they should be available. Now, when we think of security, we think of the bad guys a lot of the time. If there's software that allows hackers to get into the product, you could compromise any of those three: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, I say hackers, but one of our biggest risks in business is not just the malicious outsider, but the malicious or careless insider who could allow our information to get into the hands of the wrong people, who could affect its integrity, or who could shut something down so no one can get inside it. No doubt your company has already considered the risks to your information and the systems that process it, or you wouldn't even be on this call. But you may be wondering, how do companies with an information security management system in place differ from you in the way they face risks? Well, first of all, in an information security management system under ISO 27001, they're required to have management planning and oversight, which means that management has set goals and has measurements for knowing whether they're reaching those goals that achieve the objectives of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In order to know whether they're reaching those goals, there has to be systematic analysis and treatment of risks. You've got to drive down the amount of risk in your company by saying, well, this is a high risk item. Do I need to spend some money or do some training or change the way we do things to address our highest risks, so we work our way down and gradually reduce the risks to the company? When something does go wrong, companies with an effective ISMS investigate those problems, those weaknesses, those incidents that could lead to actual major events of shutdowns or whatever, and they have investigations and corrections, corrective action that makes sure that those security incidents aren't repeated. One of the biggest sources of risk to our company is anytime anything changes, whether it's people, whether it's changes to the bits and bytes in code that runs our systems, whether it's changes to the processes that we use in our businesses. So having robust change management that makes sure our information stays secure regardless of who's acting on it and when and why, but we've thought things through, is an example of what a company with a robust ISMS has. They evaluate through internal audits and other methods whether they are effective, and it's a company-wide approach. A robust ISMS is not something that just IT does. Well, you hear me talk about cybersecurity and information security throughout this webinar. Depending on your point of view and the background that you have, some people may refer to this as cybersecurity, and the standard itself, ISO 27001, talks about information security. The point is that you need to protect information that's important to you, whether it's online or on paper or in people's heads. So within industry, there's much discussion over the terms. Just don't get hung up. Use whatever's comfortable for your company. We'll probably refer mostly to information security in this standard because it takes a broader look at saying information. We're not talking about cargo security. We're not talking about retail security or inventory security. This has to do with information, but information in all its forms. And the reason we're so hung up on information security in the world today is because of the business risks that can happen if you have a breach of security or availability in any way. For example, your reputation could be shot, your customers could decide to go elsewhere in the short term or the long term, and certainly it costs you something to clean up the mess. But your customers may also feel the impact of a security breach. For example, they may not get their orders filled if your order management system is down or is corrupt. They may have their information exposed, which could be a long-term impact to them, and they may have cleanup costs. Certainly, when any large company has a breach of security somehow, there can be a domino effect that propagates that problem even further than you could imagine, and it causes people to distrust systems. When there's distrust in society, regulations start to come about, and you've seen some of those. For example, the HIPAA regulations in the United States for healthcare data, SOX for the financial management of a company, GDPR and other privacy regulations are regulations that have come out to make sure that our information is protected in different environments. Sometimes our approach to security is based on what customers put in their contracts or just in what our own businesses decide are important to us. But if you take advantage of a voluntary standard such as ISO 27001, you'll find that you'll cover the vast majority of customer requirements and those things that are important to your business so that hopefully you can just layer on any regulatory requirements on top without a great deal of strain. And now I'd like to turn it over to Stephen Weekly from SAI Global, the Global ICT Certification Manager, and he's going to walk us through what's actually in the standard. What is the front part of the standard, the requirements for certification say you actually have to do? Stephen?
Okay, so I guess the first point I always make is that once you've made that decision that you need an information security management system, you have to come up with some ideas about how we're going to make it look. What sort of framework are we going to have in place? And that really is the role of the standard. It provides a model for you to base your management systems on, based on what is arguably international best practice. And so it provides you with that framework. The standard, as you see it on the screen now, you're seeing the cover document from the requirements, and that is the document that we certify you against. There is a whole raft of supporting documents within the ISO 27000 family of standards, which will provide you with lots of guidance, lots of ideas on best practice to help you achieve the implementation. But it's the 27001 that you get certified against. Like most management systems, it takes a plan, do, check, act approach, but it also has something, I guess, a little bit unique for this standard to some of the other management standards and what they've had previously, in that it's very much a risk-based approach to what you do. Karen's already talked about the importance of identifying the risk and managing the risk. This reinforces that, and through that planning phase, it starts asking you to once identify all the scope that you're going to have for the ISMS, identify all the risks to the things that are within scope, and then you have to start choosing the controls that you're going to need to have in place to manage those risks. And that's where you start to look at Annex A, as Annex A from the standard gives you a list of controls to choose from. There's 114 different controls, but that's not the whole world. You may also choose to pick controls from other places, such as GDPR, such as NIST. The standard's really sort of using Annex A more as a checklist So it's saying, do your risk assessments, identify all the risks, think about the controls you need to have in place, and then when you finish that, you have to check what you've come up with against the Annex A controls, really just to make sure you haven't missed anything. And from there, it says, okay, once you've identified all of that, implement them and start operating them. But you also have to have processes in place to monitor the performance of those controls. So you're going to start having measurement things in place. Then you can review the results and compare those back to the objectives that you've set and say, are we achieving what we needed to? And then we move into the improvement phase, which is we're maybe not getting what we need. We're going to improve. So we go back to the planning phase, and basically that cycle goes on for forever. Some of the things that you will see, if you're familiar with other management system standards, things around competence are always covered. There's leadership things. The actual risk assessment is something different for this standard, and the risk requirement for risk treatment plans is also something a bit different for this standard. Talks about interested parties. If you're familiar with 9001, and there's that concept of identifying both what they call context of the organisation and interested parties. Those things are all same in 27001, but it really is that focus on risk assessment and treatment which sets it aside from the rest of them. Moving on.
And moving on, we'll go into Annex A a little bit, but I want to call your attention to the fact that the standard is divided into the part that Stephen just discussed that causes you to set up a management system. When you set up the management system, you get leadership involvement, you set your objectives, and you make sure that everyone is prepared with documented information about how we do things around here to execute the risk assessment and the risk treatment of your information assets. Make sure you apply Annex A to your to your system. And then we'll talk later about internal audit, management review, and corrective action. Those are more part of your implementation phase, and as he said, continual improvement. Annex A that Stephen was alluding to is 114 controls, those things that you are expected to do to protect your information assets. And they're divided into 14 categories, 14 domains, as we say. And I like to think of them as the bricks in the wall that you build around your information assets. As I display these, you can see, oh yeah, these are things that we have. We have locks on our doors. We have people in the server room who are making, our IT people are making sure that the computers are secure. We have things around how we do, we have firewalls and so forth. We're only allowed to use certain software. Of course, we have things in our supplier relationships. There's a new one, incident security, incident management. All eyes in the company should be on what kinds of things may be going wrong. And then business continuity. We'll talk about each one of these in just a minute apiece, but think of these Annex A controls as the categories of actions that you can take to make sure that you've got multiple layers of security around your information assets. And now my colleague Bob Bretal, and our lead implementation consultants at DESARA, and Stephen Weekly will go back and forth on giving a little bit of information on each one of these bricks in the wall, if you will. Bob?
Hi, everyone. First thing you'll probably notice here is that we're starting at domain 5. It's just a little funny numbering aspect of the standard. It starts at number 5. We have 14 domains. They're going to go from number 5 through number 18. So number 5 only has 2 controls in it, and it's a high-level thing that's providing management direction for information support, for information security, and it just wants to make sure that we have a set of policies in place and proper policies defined, and they're communicated to all of our employees and all of the relevant external parties. We'll talk some more later about external parties like suppliers, and make sure that those are all in place and they take into account all the relevant laws and regulations, like Stephen mentioned earlier, as well as any business needs like customer requirements, things that might be in our contracts, and that we also look at these on a regular basis and review our policies on a regular basis. Now I'll hand it to Stephen to talk about Domain 6.
Okay, Domain 6 is what it calls that organization of information security. That's about wanting you to start thinking about setting up the management framework that you're going to have in place to implement and operate your ISMS. So primary things it talks about there are making sure that the information security roles and responsibilities are really clearly defined. Thinking about things like segregation of duties. Certain roles, it's important, or certain processes, it is important to have that segregation of duties. So I want you to start thinking about those things. It also throws in some parts about wanting you to develop contacts with authorities or special interest groups who will help keep you up to date and knowledgeable about what's happening in the information security world. It's important that you do that, and it also throws in things around mobile devices and teleworking, which is a little bit, there's no great logic as to why it got put in there, it just did.
Moving on to Domain 7. Domain 7 is a lot of things that are related to human resources at most organizations, and it's going to cover three basic areas with the 6 controls: things that happen prior to employment, things that happen while somebody is employed, and then finally things that happen when somebody leaves employment with your company. And the other thing that's important here is that we need to ensure that it covers both employees and, where applicable, any contractors or other people who come in and have access to your information security assets. So this talks about screening requirements and things that might be required to make sure we have people who are appropriately vetted for employment, make sure that during employment people understand what they're able to, what they're supposed to do, what they're allowed to do, that we provide them proper information security training, that there is a disciplinary process if there are problems with information security, and also what we do when somebody leaves to ensure that we turn off their access in a prompt fashion and nothing happens while they're gone.
Okay, the asset management requirements sit around, you need to create an inventory of your information assets. And by information assets, we're talking about, one, the information itself, but also things like hardware, applications, networks. We should understand and have an inventory of all of those assets. They should all be assigned an owner, and that those owners are responsible for setting the rules for the acceptable use of those assets. We also have to have an information classification scheme. You would have seen examples of that where you think things were commercial in confidence, or secret or top secret. Everyone needs to have some sort of classification scheme, which then sets the rules on how those different categories of assets can be used, and it specifically calls out some requirements around media handling rules.
Domain 9 is all about access control. We have 14 controls, which is a lot for a section, and this one is all about making sure that we take an appropriate look at all of our information assets and our systems, and we limit access to things to people who have a need to use them. We also have in place appropriate mechanisms for managing user access, for reviewing user access, and also a system for access controls to make sure we have the right kind of secure logon procedures. We've implemented appropriate password strengths, and also at an admin level, making sure that admins can't use privileged utility programs or things like that in a way that's not logged, so they can't kind of like get around our security system and do things that aren't logged. So this is all about protecting the access to our information and our systems.
Okay, the next domain is really about the use of cryptography within your business. If you've decided that you need to have encryption, then this is the part that talks about it. Obviously, if you're going to implement cryptographic controls, you need to have a set of basic principles agreed and applied. And so the standard here is asking you to set policies on how it has to be used. How's that going to work? Who's involved? What are the principles that have to be followed? And then one of the key things with, pardon the pun, with cryptography is the actual management of the cryptographic keys. And so again, it wants you to establish a formal policy on the use and protection and life cycle of the cryptographic keys.
The next section is another pretty large section. It's all about physical and environmental security. So we have sections on secure areas, making sure that we have the right kind of security perimeter set up, that we have mechanisms from maybe RFID badges, key locks, things where somebody have to type a code in on a door to get into it. But basically, we are physically preventing people from getting to areas that have particularly sensitive information in them. And then the other part of this section talks about the kinds of things that we do to physically protect our equipment, making sure that it's sited appropriately, that we're doing the appropriate kind of maintenance on it, that we have rules about people taking physical equipment off site. If we have to dispose of equipment, that we dispose of it in a secure fashion. And then one that applies to all employees, but we have stuff about rules so that people don't leave unattended equipment just lying around logged in. Just making sure that they lock their computer when they walk away from it, and also don't leave papers with sensitive information laying around on desks or by printers. These are all things that just help our physical security.
Okay, domain 12 is one of the largest ones. It talks about operations security. So it's talking about day-to-day operations for our information processing facilities, in other words, our computer systems. It says you should have documented procedures for the operators to follow. We should have a formal change management process. We should have things in place to protect us from malware. It talks about logging and monitoring of activity. So it wants you to think about what events should you be logging. It specifically talks about creating logs of operators or admin activities, and also thinking about how to protect that log information. And then it also wants you to think about how you're going to manage technical vulnerabilities. So how are you going to manage things like patching to make sure that you have an appropriate thing? Examples of how you don't do that, if you think back to that WannaCry virus that came out, was it last year or the year before now? The majority of sad stories that you heard about people who got affected by that were ones who hadn't had their patches up to date. If their patching had been up to date, they wouldn't have been in trouble from it. So it's a very important part of the standard, although it really doesn't make it sound so much when you read it. But so there's a whole host of things in that section there. Really just around the IT operational side of things more than anything.
Okay, next up is communication security, and this is going to be two main parts. It's the security of our network itself, where we make sure that our network stays secure, and our IT department is usually going to make sure that they're managing that, but that we actually have security mechanisms in place, and people can't get into networks when they're not supposed to. A real vulnerability that a lot of places have is on Wi-Fi networks, where they just don't have appropriate controls in place so that somebody can come into the office and they can get at all kinds of things through there. Or other things that we've seen quite frequently is if somebody plugs into a network jack in a conference room, they suddenly have complete access to the internal network without even having to provide any kind of password or authentication. Very bad. Another thing is information transfer, and we have all kinds of controls here to talk about what we want to do to make sure that if we're transferring information in or out of the organization, that we put appropriate security mechanisms around that. And that includes everything from mechanisms for using email in a secure fashion down to making sure that we get appropriate confidentiality or NDAs in place when we're dealing with external parties.
Okay, the next section is really around it's around our system acquisition, development, maintenance, as the name suggests. So think about whether we're buying systems, modifying existing ones, or creating new systems. This part's really about making sure that we understand the security requirements up front. We build those into the requirements, we build those into the design, and then we appropriately test them to make sure that everything's going to work from a security perspective. It's got a number of things in there. It wants secure development policies. It wants some engineering principles defined. But the basic idea behind it is, let's make sure that for anything we're doing, whether we're buying, modifying, or creating new systems, let's build our security requirements in at the very beginning and make sure we carry them through into the design, into the construction, and into the testing.
Next up is supplier relationships. And here we're just trying to make sure that we protect our information when we have third-party organizations, suppliers working with us. So this goes into a lot of ensuring that when we set up a contract with a third party, that we include information related to how they're supposed to respect our information, and in many cases how we would respect their information and protect it into those contracts that we put into place. And also with subcontracting, that we make sure that if we entrust a supplier with some information, if they themselves subcontract, that flows down the chain to their subcontractors. And then there's also an important part here where we make sure that we monitor and review those supplier relationships to make sure that there haven't been any issues that we need to address on a regular basis.
As we run our business and we operate our information security management system, things will happen from time to time that we would consider to be security related. Now they could be a security event, for example, an alarm going off, weaknesses that have been observed, or actual incidents where something negative has happened. What the standard here wants is to have a formal process on how to capture those so that we know what went wrong, have a formal investigation process so we can work out why it went wrong, and then thinking about how we can stop that from happening again. It specifically talks about making sure we learn from those incidents. So have ways to actually not just respond to incidents and deal with them. We have to do that, of course, but we should learn from those, and we should have a way to learn from them to make sure that when we stop something, we stop it for good. We don't let it recur. And then the other side that it talks about there is when you do collect any evidence of incidents, you need to do those in line with your legal jurisdictions around the rules for collection of evidence, just in case that information needs to go to a court of law.
Next up are information security aspects related to business continuity management. Now, the 27001 standard is an information security standard. There's a separate standard about business continuity systems, but we're going to, in this set of controls, assume that we have business continuity in place and that our business has taken into account that things can happen that will disrupt our business, systems going down, you know, all other kinds of things, maybe denial of services attacks or whatever, that are going to cause problems, and we want to get those systems back up. What we need to do in this section of controls is ensure that we have things in place to make sure that our information security controls in general don't go out the window when everybody is all excited about getting the systems back up and running. A lot of times people will tend to want to make shortcuts and do other things that could diffuse a lot of our carefully placed information security controls during the excitement of getting our systems back up and running. And we want to just keep in mind that even if we make some shortcuts, we would have to make sure we undo those and make sure that we keep the system secure during as much as possible, and absolutely once things are back up and running, that we go back and revalidate to make sure that all information security protocols are fully back in place.
Okay, the final domain is around compliance. What it wants you to do is to explicitly identify all of your contractual, legislative, and regulatory requirements, and not just identify them, but to document them, and also what your approach will be to making sure that you maintain compliance with those. Specifically, it calls out issues around intellectual property rights, protection of records, privacy, and cryptographic controls. So it doesn't sort of look much when you first read it, but the fact that it wants you to specifically identify and document all of those requirements and your approach to how you're going to make sure you maintain compliance can make it a big piece of work for you.
Okay, that takes us through the 14 domains, number 5 through 18. So you should have a good feel for the ways that ISO 27001, the actions that ISO 27001 expects you to take to protect the integrity, availability, and confidentiality of your information. And also the first part of where Stephen was talking about, how do you actually set up a management system that will make sure all of those controls that you have to apply are happening correctly, consistently, and effectively across your organization. So that would bring you to, how do you actually implement ISO 27001? Well, the DESARA group specializes in helping companies implement many different standards, 9001, 27001, other standards like that. And this is our model that we use. We do the planning and implementation and prepare you for certification, and then hand you over to your certification body that you should have already made arrangements with up front to perform the certification audit. We can't certify you, so we're not checking our own work in that way, only through internal audits. Now, if you're following along in the workbook for the course, you should be on page 5 of 7 now, and we'll talk a little bit about what's in phase 1 planning. Most important part of planning is that you have the executive team on board. They're going to be spending a lot of time and money. People's attention and ways of working are going to be changing, and they need to know that this is not something that's just business as usual. There will be changes, and they'll be for the benefit of the organization. So you start out by identifying a core team, the people in the major functions of the business, IT, HR, facilities, and so forth, who will have something to say about all those different controls. And then you get that core team trained and set up the beginning of how big of a chunk of the organization are we going to bite off here? What's our scope of the organization that we're going to certify? As you can see by the controls, it's not just talking about certifying IT. You have to look at the organization, because the leak of information, or the problem could come from well-intentioned but untrained individuals in the organization, could cause a breach. So once you've got your core team trained, you go through project planning and get a project charter from management with how long should this take and who's going to be assigned to it. We have a kickoff program, high impact launch session, that lasts either 5 days or 8 days, depending on how much you want to get done and how much of your people's time you can put into such a program. Once you've done your planning, you decide under the planning phase, you would have begun to decide which are the controls we need to apply to protect the assets that we've planned on protecting. And then in phase 2, you go through actually defining, not just out of the book, the control says you shall do such and such, but actually writing the documentation that says this is the way we do things around here and getting people on board with new practices. That will require a certain amount of documentation. There are documents and records that are required by ISO 27001. You'll also set up that overall management system with all the measures and objectives and internal audits and management review and all the parts of the management system that make sure your risk management activity hangs together. This is important that you get the entire staff on board and, for example, get all the eyes and ears in the business practicing incident management. When they see something, they say something, they report it to the IT help desk or whatever process you've set up so that everybody can be working on continually improving the system and recognizing when something goes wrong. We estimate this takes about a year. We've had companies go as long as 2 years, and we've got one that's speeding through with a very small, tight system that'll finish in less than a year, but plan on about a year-long project for implementing. Once you're about, when we're working with our clients, we say once you figure you're about 80% of the way done with your implementation, you do one round of internal audits. Audit everything. Did they really understand? Are they actually implementing? Do your corrective action from that, have a review with management about how the system is going, and then do your final readiness assessment, like a mock audit. If we were to meet our certification body today, would we be ready for certification? Would we pass? Would we have any major nonconformities? Might have minor nonconformities, things that have been looked at in a different way by the certification body, but did we cover everything we have to cover? And then you're handed over to your certification body, and I'll leave it to Stephen to talk about what happens with what does a certification body do to make sure that you're worthy of getting an ISO 27001 certificate. Stephen?
Okay, thanks, Karen. Well, Karen just sort of mentioned about sort of the process to get you to that point where you'll be ready for certification. One of the things that would involve if you're using DESARA Group is that they will help you get to that point. One of the things that we offer is we can come and do what we call a gap assessment. Generally, we offer that where you haven't been using consultants, because consultants will perform the same role. But we can offer that, which is it's effectively an audit against the standard, but without any serious commitment against the certification. It gets serious when we move into our stage 1 and stage 2 audits. They're the two that count towards the certification. The stage 1 audit is primarily a focus on document review and making sure that you have actually got the system in place and that it's operating, or at least to the point where we decide that yes, it would be really okay to move forward into the next phase. The stage 1 audits are generally looking at the documentation, looking at the scope that you've established, looking at the assets you've identified, looking at the risks, and looking at the controls that you've selected to implement. We usually only would be involving a small number of your people at that point, those responsible for maintaining the ISMS and senior management. So it's really, that's about understanding that you've actually put your system together, it's got the appropriate structure, it's implemented, or at least you'll know when you'll be finishing the implementation. And then when we move on to stage 2, it's not about going back over the documentation. It's about saying, well, we've already confirmed that there's a management system in place. Now you need to show us the evidence that all of that's been implemented and it's working appropriately. And so the focus really is around evidencing the implementation. We do that by talking to the people who are responsible for doing all the different processes. So the audience for the stage 2 audits is significantly larger. When do we do the 2 and how long do they take? The timing, the amount of days we spend on stage 1 and stage 2 is entirely dependent on the nature of your organisation, and we determine that at the time that you apply to us for certification. So there's no one size that fits all. It's all determined specifically for your company. I was going somewhere else and I just lost my train of thought. Anyway, so about the audits, we like to say that from an audit perspective, we're there to not just be an audit like you might think of a financial audit, which is just 100% inspection. Our audits are always a sampling process. We're there to confirm that you have compliance with requirements of the standard. The idea is we talk to the relevant people about it, look at the evidence that we can see, and if we can see compliance, then we go, great, that's good, we move on. It's not an exercise to keep digging and digging until we find things wrong. That doesn't help you and it doesn't help us. But it's really about just seeing those confirmations that things are working properly within the system. It's always very much a two-way street with our audits. Again, it's not about just locking us in the corner with a whole pile of documentation or access to a computer. It's an interactive thing. We do our audits by talking to your people all the time throughout the audit. See, there's a note there. I probably should have mentioned this way back at the beginning, but when we've said it's not only about IT, the whole thing about information security management systems is not only about IT. It involves a lot more people than just the IT people, and a lot more processes than just the IT processes. So the idea that it can all be run and managed purely within the IT department really doesn't work all that well. And if it does, I think you need to seriously question the scope that you've set for it. That's probably about it. The other thing is doing these stage 1 and stage 2 audits is what we call out the certification actual audit. It's that 2-stage thing, but it is not simply a one-off exercise. It goes into a 3-year rolling cycle, and so first year we do, or year 0 we will do the stage 1 and stage 2 certification audits. Following year we do what we call a surveillance audit. Then the year after that a surveillance audit, and then on the 3rd year we do a recertification audit, which is almost a replay of the initial stage 1 and stage 2 audits. And that 3-year cycle continues forever. A little bit about SAI Global. What's good about us? Even though you may not have heard of us, we are a big company. We're in over 130 countries around the world now, with local auditors spread all over the world. We do have lots of technical training, risk management solutions. If you need tools to capture your risks in, we've got some really good ones of those. I can't say much about them because it's not my part of the business. One of the things that we do pride ourselves on is that we have very experienced auditors. Particularly compared to some of our competitors. Myself, I've been doing this for 26 years. My colleague Mike, who I guess is sort of my counterpart in the US, he's been with SAI for I think 16 or more years. Most of our auditors have been with us for a long time. They've got lots of experience in the industry and lots of audit experience. The other thing that we do is that we're accredited, and what that means is that as a certification body, we have to comply with international standards on how to be a certification body to make sure that we have appropriate processes in place, that we suitably train and qualify our people, we have the right processes to review everything that happens, and we have these accreditation bodies that come in and actually come and audit us against those standards on how to be a certifying body. So if you're looking for a certification body, you need to make sure that they are accredited. The things we see on the screen there, ANAB, CNCA, JASANS, which is from Australia, SCC or UCAS from the UK, are the accreditation bodies that come out and do that sort of work. But all I can say is you would be in safe hands with SAI Global.
And I'd like to echo that, but before I say anything else, I want to say now would be a great time. If you've been listening along and you've said um, you like a little more information, you maybe missed something on the worksheet, I will tell you that you'll get a recording of this presentation afterwards and a copy of the slides and a copy of the worksheet, not filled out for you. That's up to you to fill out. But you can ask any questions right now, and I'd urge you to do so because, as Stephen was just pointing out, you've got one of the most experienced CB folks on the line that's out there, because the certification process to ISO 9001, which a lot of us are familiar with, was back from the 80s, and Stephen was around, back at the beginning for that kind of thing, and has been 27001 since it's been around pretty much as well. So ask your questions, and I have a question for you as well, if you wouldn't mind answering. For what do you need? What do you think is going to be the hardest part of implementing for you? Is it the planning, the implementation, the internal assessing? Is it working with a certification body and closing your audit? Or do you have a need for training? So if you could go ahead and in the question section pop in what you might be needing in the future. And as I said, you'll get a survey that'll say, do you want us to contact you as soon as this one is closed? But certainly SAI Global would like to get a phone call or get in touch with you if that's something you'll be needing. But use this chance to talk to Bob about implementation. Bob was talking about all the controls, and he's very knowledgeable about what it takes to implement. So list your questions in the question panel on the GoToWebinar screen. And I'll tell you a little bit about, I wanted to mention about some nice things about SAI Global. We've worked with SAI Global for many years, and I say work with meaning that our clients have gone on to get certified by SAI Global. And while neither one of our companies can flat out recommend the other one as saying you should go with these guys, because that gets kind of stinky in terms of, like, are you in cahoots where you'll well, if DESARA helped you, we'll automatically pass you. You can't have that kind of thing going on. So we work with different certification bodies, but we work with only those that we respect and trust. And SAI Global is one of the top companies in the world to use for your certification body. I've just gone through an audit with Mike, the guy he mentioned from the U.S. that does a lot of the U.S. audits. And once again, a personable, not consultative, but conversational. He'll work with you in a way that you don't feel like you're getting the third degree on your management system. Okay, so the DESARA group guides and accelerates your ISMS development. And when I was talking to Mike during this audit recently, he said, oh yeah, you have companies come in here who don't even pay attention to the front half of the standard. They just do all the controls and they think now they can get certified, and that's not what it's all about. So our role is to help you get to the certification process with a system that serves your company and your customers and will get you to certification. Also, we want to streamline your management system implementation so you don't spend any more time or expense than you need to put a good system in place. So your next steps for certification would be to study ISO 27001. Now, ISO 27001 is the standard that you get certified to, but there are at least a dozen more companion standards, ISO 27002, 27003, and so on, that give you guidance on how to use the standard. So you need to study the family of standards as they apply to you. And you're probably going to need some training, whether you have DESARA or a company like us come into your company, or you find a public class, or what the DESARA group has coming up in our virtual classroom, coming up just a little over a month from now, will be our first offering of an internal audit class. And I'm interested if you'll list this as in the question panel. Do you feel that your auditors are ready to go for doing your internal audits, or do they need more training or more coaching? That's something DESARA does as well. So after you've studied the standard, you do your self-assessment, and whether you're, what objectives do you have for a management system, present it to management. If they're committed, they're ready to go, then you go through the planning, implementation, and certification process for ongoing improvement. And DESARA can reach in and help you at any point of that, working with your management to decide if this is something that's the way they want to go, or educating them so they know their role in the standard, working you through with the implementation, or doing the gap assessment pre-certification. Are we really ready for assessment, or do we need to not waste our time with that and go back and do some other things? So DESARA can support you in any number of ways. And now we'll just move on to some of the questions that have come in. And Let's see, I see one came in here. One of the biggest hurdles will be evaluating all the inputs to risk assessment, not just Annex A, but GDPR and others, as well as the legal and other requirements, just like you would do for other standards such as environmental, health, and safety standards. Well, that's one of the things that working with someone outside can do for you is, like with Bob's experience, going through and saying, wait a minute, look at the risk that you have here. We at DESARA have a structured method to take you through analyzing what are your assets, how critical are they to the business or to the customer, and then what are the threats and vulnerabilities that you need to address through controls. How extensive do your controls need to be to get you to the level of risk that your company is comfortable taking? And then having somebody who's expert enough in the additional controls that you're working to mitigate risks against, such as GDPR and any others that your customers may have put on you. So that is a big tough part of 27001. After we do our internal audit class, our next virtual class will be a deep dive into risk management. We'll also be doing later in the fall a deep dive into the controls, into how do these controls actually apply. And then we'll be doing a lead auditor module to add on to those of you who take the internal audit course and then say, okay, now I'm ready to lead my own audits. Let's see, there's another question here on, this question I'm going to turn over to Stephen to answer. It says, during implementation, do you have to implement all the controls listed in Annex A prior to the certification audit? Or could you work for certification on a specific set of the controls that you're doing and work towards the other controls after certification? Stephen, can you talk to us a little bit about that? And then I'll also get Bob's take on it.
Sure. The short answer is no, you can't focus just on a few controls because we look at a scope, and the scope's not defined by the controls. Having said that, because what the standard requires you to do is to, after you've done your risk assessment and you've identified all the controls you need to implement, you have to then check that against Annex A, and you have to prepare what they call a statement of applicability, which basically you have to take all 114 controls and for every single one of those state why it is or isn't applicable to you. And so if you can justify why a particular control isn't applicable to you, that's fine, and that's those ones you don't need to implement. Anything that you've said, well, it is applicable to us, you have to be able to say why it's applicable. The first part of that is the easiest answer to why do we have to have a control in place. It's because we're managing a risk that we've identified. And then the obvious part of the management system is if you've identified the need for the control, then you have to implement it. That's and that's the basic things. Do they all have to be done before the completion or be implemented before the completion of stage 2 audit? Is not clearly defined anywhere, and some of the words in the standard lead you to believe that it's okay not to have everything implemented at the time of the stage 2 audit. The rule that I set for our organisation at least is that when we trace the if we look at controls that haven't been implemented, the first question I'll ask is, what was the risk associated with that control? And then we look at the risk level. And if it was a high level risk and you haven't implemented the controls, then you won't get certified. If it was a low level risk and you've got implementation planned within the next 6 months, then that would be okay. So there's no exact one answer to that. It's going to matter. We're going to look at everything on its individual merits, but in particular, tying those controls back to the risk to understand why you needed to have that control in the first place. Because if you said it's a high risk that you're managing, then you're not going to get away without actually putting in the controls. Did that answer the question?
You know, Matt, if that didn't answer your question, would you please follow on with that? You did specifically.
Can I add just can I add one statement to that? You
Please
know,
do.
the thing there is you really want to look at what Stephen said is the control applicable to you? And it's generally not a good idea to just say, well, we have all this stuff implemented, therefore that's what we want to be in scope, and then ignore the other stuff. The things that are not going to be applicable are things that really don't apply to your business. I mean, things that I see get taken out of scope a lot. There's a control about having related to loading docks. And if your building doesn't have a loading dock, then maybe that one's not applicable. You know, there's thing about outsourcing development. And if you don't outsource development, you might say that that control is not applicable to your business. But it wouldn't be a good idea to say, you know, like for instance, the clear desk, clear screen policy. Well, we haven't implemented that, so we want to take that out of scope. I mean, that's a very core control, and you know, you have to look at these things on their merits. And as Stephen said, if a control is there and it is mitigating some security hole that would otherwise exist in your organization, then you have to either have it fully implemented or, as he said, be strongly on the path to having it implemented and have a very detailed plan and be very close to the point where upon risk analysis, it's not a huge risk to the organization having that control not fully implemented yet.
Perfect. That brings me back to something that I was talking to Mike, the CB auditor, who I've been following around for the last month, works for SAI Global. He said that when he goes into a stage 1 audit in a company that's used no outside support, maybe didn't really fully understand the standard, just focused on the controls, you do have to do the entirety of clauses 4 through 10 of ISO 9001. Now I'm saying clauses versus Annex A. Annex A goes domain 5 through 18. The body of the standard goes ISO 27001 clauses 4 through 10. And these are the things that say that you establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve your management system. It was this part that said that have you identified your interested parties in the context of your organization? Have you made sure that you've got competence of people and effective communications? Have you established objectives? Do you have a documented system? A lot of companies would just want, according to Mike, would just say, hey, we've done our risk assessment and our risk treatment, but they didn't do anything about internal audit and management review. They don't have a working corrective action system and certainly don't have continual improvement. So while you may have some of the controls that don't apply to you, or that as or that maybe you are very low risk and maybe you're going to beef them up as you go along, you do have to do everything on this list. And I also wanted to say about, do you have to use all of the controls? Different companies, depending on their context, depending on what they're trying to protect, from whom they're trying to protect it, what the threats they face are, the nature of the products that they make, may have to implement some of the controls in a much more robust manner than others would. For example, if you're doing software development in a leased space with no loading dock, you've got 20 employees, you may find that that really encryption of your laptops and putting a lock with a badge on it on the front door, and you've got all your is sufficient because all of your servers are up in the cloud someplace, and you've got a supplier relationship with those people. That would be an example of where you don't need to have Fort Knox environmental and physical controls on your business. That maybe somebody who's manufacturing ICT equipment that could have all sorts of things embedded in it would have different requirements, that they may need to have security to even keep people from looking at parts of their prototypes that are in works. So the degree of application of those controls is also some wiggle room that you've got there. You don't have to do everything to the nth degree. And Matt says that did answer his question, and I guess he's saying that Karen went on and answered it for even 5 minutes more than it needed to be. I don't see any other questions coming in, and we are past the top of the hour, but as I put at the end, our contact information is here, and you're immediately going to get a survey after this. If you'd please answer it with either a yes or a no, or which one of us you'd like to talk to, that would be just great, so we can get in touch with you and not bother you with phone calls if you're not interested. And I'd like to thank everyone for attendance today. Look for communications about our upcoming classes and other educational webinars that you may find useful in implementing ISO 27001. Thank you everyone for attending. This webinar is now ended.